Welcome to some rambly fun times. Here's a friendly note that I am not a video essayist. More of a one-woman podcast, if you will. As a clarification for anyone who has seen or is interested in watching the video I made on the Georgia shooting some years ago, I do regret parts of that video where I state as fact things that are really more my personal, semi-educated speculations. I'm leaving the video up because from a broad perspective, I still agree with the main points of it. But from now on, I really wanted to make it clear that most of the things I say on here are my personal opinions, thoughts, or things that I've sort of brought together as educated guesses. So to get to the video, I love thinking a lot about media, and since I have this channel, I figured at some point I may as well use it to record and talk about my thoughts, whether anyone sees it or not. Of course, sometimes I will break off to talk about larger ideas in media or specifically Asian American perspectives on certain things, but for the most part, I think I'll be sticking to specific pieces of media since I'm sure other people have more clever things to say about media tropes and analysis than I do. But before I begin with any of that, I wanted to address media analysis itself. I'll be talking about media analysis from two perspectives, though they both boil down to the same principle. The first is from the perspective of someone who engages in media criticism and analysis. The second from the perspective of a writer and creator. There's a channel on YouTube called Sean, some of whose videos I genuinely love. He breaks down things in a very thoughtful way, so I'd really recommend at least checking them out if you like your average video essayist. But one of his earliest videos, which I can no longer find on his channel, is on another channel I really love, Dominic Noble. Dominic Noble, in case you don't know who he is, does the pretty well-known at this point Lost in Adaptation series where he compares pieces of media to often the books off of which they are based. Now, I don't know if Sean's changed his opinion on Dom, if he took the video down because he thinks it no longer applies because of how Dom's channel itself has changed, or if he just decided he didn't care for the inevitable backlash to making any criticism of a popular YouTuber. But from what I can remember of this video, he argues that it's problematic to judge a piece of media based on how well it serves as an adaptation, because a piece of media should primarily be viewed for what it is on its own. I'm not here to shit on Sean, and I don't have the capacity to pick out the specific points of his video anymore, but from a broad perspective, this is an excellent illustration of one of the problems I see throughout media analysis, especially on YouTube. Functionally, my belief is that there are more or less valid readings of media, but rarely singularly true readings of media. In this particular case, I have no problems with the assertion that it is worth it to look at a piece of media for its own sake. In fact, this was precisely why I never disliked the Percy Jackson films, even though I was a huge fan of the book series. While I didn't really think they were good adaptations, I had a lot of fun with at least the first one as a basic action flick, and that was how I chose to see them, as basic action flicks. I do, however, have problems with the assertion that it is not worth it to analyze their value as adaptations, because the act of adapting a work is a sort of art in its own way. It displays the artist's vision of the original work, as well as not only potentially introducing others to that original work, but also providing different perspectives on what sticks out to different people about that piece of media. And yes, I do think there is even merit in shitting on an adaptation precisely because it's an adaptation. A good example of this is Ella Enchanted. Watch it by itself, it's honestly not that bad. It's not good either, but it's like any other generic teen flick at the time. Mid-budget and perfectly acceptable. But as an adaptation, it spits on what makes the original book, the thing it is marketing itself on, unique. It discounts the importance of Ella's willpower in her struggle with the curse, which is how she ends up breaking the curse in the first place. Makes something generic from something unique, immediately plays itself as a Cinderella story instead of going from the backstory the way that the book does. It does the whole enemy to lovers thing, specifically when Ella Enchanted is one of those unique pieces of media where two main leads just fall in love from an organic friendship. It's not bad because it's just a bad story. It is, in fact, in part bad because it actively takes another story and mutilates the very things that makes that story good. I call these adaptations by people who actively hate the source material and its fans, by the way. Similarly, while I love Dom's video reviews where he rants about the portrayal of toxic relationships in 50 Shades and Twilight, there are also people who point out that female fantasies, even the toxic ones, have their place psychologically. While I don't think Twilight and 50 Shades are particularly good examples of even toxic female fantasies due to their utter lack of self-awareness as such, I actually genuinely agree with that point. It is, in fact, horrible that there might be a correlation between people who read 50 Shades and were in violent relationships. It is also true that women should have avenues to explore their fantasies, even about things that are objectively negative. That's part of the reason sometimes why people write. It's why people express violence in writing even, and a lot of these fantasies zero in on the female desire to have someone be singularly devoted to them, no matter their flaws or objections. Have someone know what they want without having to shame themselves by admitting it because of a society that so intensely shames women for having desires at all. That's not inherently negative. My point here is that multiple viewpoints can have merit, even when they conflict with each other. Not only different methods of interpretation as a whole, but different interpretations, even viewed within similar lens, can be valid too. When I talk about a piece of media, I will talk about what interests me or how I chose to interpret something, but that doesn't and shouldn't mean anything about how you or anyone else feels about it, especially when interpretation itself is more murky art form than anything else. People talk a lot about their opinion on media being objective, but the idea itself is based on the flawed premise that interpretation is an objective process, and I really think there are only a couple extremely narrow versions of objectivity within the media analysis sphere. I can say, well, objectively, when a character says they love another character and spends all of their time thinking about and trying to help that other character, the one and only analysis is that the character does, in fact, love the person they're talking about. But seen from someone with a different perspective, those same words and actions can look like possessiveness or utility or selfishness or whatever else. Because stories never really end in universe, never show us every last nitty-gritty piece of every little thing someone has ever thought or done or will do. Just as we can have different interpretations of what a person says to us in the real world, it's fair to have different interpretations of the words and actions of a character. We may have more insight into characters than we do real-life people, but rarely can we be confident that we have all insight or that it's not being colored by the narrator, whether they are a conscious narrator or not. I do think some interpretations will be more valid or less valid, but very few will be objectively wrong, particularly when it comes to looking at them in the context of not just the author's intention, so much as the work's interaction with reality. To close off this section, I want to talk about Lolita, and I guess to an extent, Death of the Author, though don't stone me, I won't be calling it that throughout. Trigger warning here if you have never heard of Lolita for discussions of child abuse. Here's the time code if you want to skip this part. Final Girl Studios does a lot of videos on the subconscious violence done upon female bodies by the male gaze in media, and in particular, she talks about the novel Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov a lot. This is a particularly valid comparison in my opinion, since from what I understand of the novel, it focuses intensely on the of a little girl from the perspective of the past. And in case you picked up from my phrasing, I have never read this novel. But the fact that I haven't read it is actually going to be a part of my point. Final Girl Studios argues, along with other people interpreting the same work, that the novel is a trap of sorts, that Nabokov never intended for it to be a tragic love story, but rather an explicit indictment of the gaze, to use her terminology. I am not saying there's anything wrong with interpreting Nabokov's novel this way, nor am I opposed to the idea that this was likely Nabokov's explicit intention in writing the book. But I think there is a missed opportunity in the way that she talks about the interpretation of Lolita as a failure of reading. True, I think that if this trap was Nabokov's intention and if he wrote it well, as I've heard enough people claim to be assured of, then on a media literacy scale, seeing it as a tragic forbidden romance is a less accurate and less valid reading of the work. But I do also think that the result she talks about is actually entirely predictable from its very premise. I do not need to have read the book to see exactly how it got to where it is. Her long, multiple videos about pedophiles in Hollywood, the pervasive permissiveness of seeing 15-year-olds or 12-year-olds as old enough to objectify and force into essentially legally permitted pornography, the disrespect with which not only women's bodies have been treated in media, but specifically young girls in their naivety and youth. They're all excellent videos, but they also make my point for me. Pro-pedophilic readings of Nabokov's Lolita, a story which even in synopsis is written from the perspective of a man who treats a vulnerable 12-year-old as some seasoned seductress, are perhaps not valid if you look at the text itself with your brain fully on, knowing what the plan is, but they are perfectly valid in the mind of all the shallow men who see young women of any age as fair game. Those readings are not only perfectly valid in the minds of the pedophiles trying to justify themselves that preying on children is normal, they are in some ways, by nature of the work, inevitable, because that is the perspective they are bringing to this novel. Jack Saint touches briefly in his video on Skylar from Breaking Bad the way that sometimes to critique a thing, you end up portraying the thing you want to critique. And in portraying it, those people who already see the world through the lens of the thing you're critiquing will see it as not a critique at all, but a triumph. Now, there's another person who, I'm forgetting who it is right now, who basically argued that this is not accurate in the case of Skylar because of the way in which Breaking Bad often frames Walter as being in the right, thus automatically demonizing Skylar. I'm not going to argue about that one way or another because I think if you just look at it from the perspective of actions, yeah, Walter's in the wrong. So people who are falling for the framing, I mean, that's part of it, you know? Essentially, what Jack Saint argues there applies here. When Humbert rants about how ugly and filthy adult women are, for someone who doesn't see it that way, his words are disgusting, indicative of how little he respects the humanity of adult women and how much more he will force that disrespect onto this vulnerable child. For the many hundreds and thousands of secret pedophiles who agree with him, built up and bolstered by a society that diminishes women unless they are, as they say, young and beautiful, all they see is confirmation of their own thoughts. I'm also going to take this idea just a step further, though. Whether or not I would agree that this profile reading is the most accurate or the intentioned reading of the novel, I think to dismiss viewpoints that are less thought through is precisely how we get a book that has actually ruined lives. In Nikki Carrione's video on the student-teacher romance trope, she talks about the presence of the Lolita book in My Dark Vanessa, Excavation, and even Pretty Little Liars. She explains the same thing Final Girl Studios does about Nabokov's likely intentions, his insistence that covers of the book have no little girls, his hatred of the idea that Humbert and Lolita be married in the movie editions, highlighting his own dislike of normalizing child exploitation. I'm not here to fact-check any of these little factoids. Forgive the common use of the word. But I did check briefly to make sure that she's right about Lolita featuring in 2 books based on the experience of women exploited in their teens. And these 2 are not the only ones, one book even being titled Being Lolita. What I find particularly uncomfortable here is that while the role the novel plays in the exploitation of teen girls is mentioned, it's never acknowledged that the novel itself has contributed to the harm of these girls. Certainly, it's possible for these girls to have been exploited without the book, and I'm not arguing that Lolita creates pedophiles because no, that's not what I believe. But when you put out a book that is about the exploitation of children, where the exploiter is the protagonist and narrator, very often the role people first learn to identify with in media, it surprises me that the intention of the premise is presumed to divorce its impact from reality. that children who are still honing their own media literacy skills are particularly vulnerable to being sucked into the profile reading that is so easily accessible because it's written from that perspective to begin with, and so widely accepted because our society already condones the glorification of a woman's youth and beauty over her humanity, should not have been surprising to anyone. And I also think it shouldn't be taken lightly just because the people doing it, quote unquote, aren't as media literate. People who don't read media thoughtfully can be just as shrewd when it comes to how they can use that media as people who do read media thoughtfully. Dismissing a reading because you don't think it's valid, and certainly I think it's fair to critique the validity of somebody else's critique, is in my opinion dangerously naive, especially today. Alright, so that got real heavy for a second. If you want other videos where media analysis is broken down and thought through more carefully, Jack Saint's video on Alice in Wonderland briefly touches on one prominent way in which media can be objectively bad. And the Sin Squad's video on fascist ideas in The Lion King spends the end of it dissecting different readings of media and their validity. But the rest of this video will finally pivot around to my thoughts on media analysis through the lens of a writer. I'm not a professional author. I write both for the enjoyment I get out of it and for the meaning I find in it. I mainly write fiction, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. If enough people see this video and ask me to share some of my writing, I will, but let's not go there for today. I was talking to a friend of mine one day, met him on a writing website, so, we talk about media sometimes. And he brought up a book he was reading on the biggest umbrella of genres accepted to exist. I had never read this book, so he summarized the supposed genres broadly for me, and we started going back and forth on what fit into each of these mother genres, how detailed those descriptions are, and how ubiquitously they can be applied. Until I finally said, in as much as this is helpful for you and how you read narrative, that's all that fundamentally matters about it. It, by which I meant creative writing truisms, has no value in and of itself. Because he knows me, he accepted that without question, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that not everyone would really jive with that sentiment. As I mentioned with media analysis above, I've more and more seen this idea that there's a singular, distillable truth even in media, and anything opposed to that truth is patent falsehood. I'm an ivory tower scientist by trade, and what people might call a hard science, though I don't really like that term. So it's not that I don't believe in singular truth existing. But when it comes to stories, and specifically to fashioning stories with your own hand, these kinds of creative writing truisms, these analyses of how stories must and have always existed in order to be successful, should only really be taken in as much as someone finds them helpful. There are stories and executions of them that I think largely we can all agree are bad, but the way we sometimes look at stories from the specific lens of someone's narrative about how stories function, I think can often limit our ability to look at any story, including our own, outside of those lenses. Save the Cat, The Hero's Journey, books on genre, 3-act structure, show don't tell, hard versus soft magic systems, the top 50 questions to ask yourself during world building, do's and don'ts about dialogue, these aren't objective truth. They're one person's opinion and analysis from the stories they like and have experienced. The Hero's Journey, while I understand is typically applied to adventure stories, marketed itself as truth about all stories in general. Imagine if every story had to live up to that standard to be accepted, or if all authors had written their stories from the assumption that it had to follow the hero's journey in some form. Would Alice in Wonderland have ever been published? Would any of Jane Austen's books? Those both break so many conventions you'd think by law they should be universally panned, but instead they still manage to be emotionally affecting, clever, and thoughtful. I don't like engaging with writing courses, books, and online lessons, not because they have no merit, but because the only merit they have is in helping a storyteller realize their vision, use their creativity to its fullest, and share that in a compelling way with others. I find that advice restrictive because I write to have fun and stretch my creative muscles, but if it helps you, that's what matters. There is merit in them as long as you're not stopping yourself from doing things and telling the story that you want to tell in the way that you want to tell it. Overly Sarcastic Productions Trope Talks is one of my favorite YouTube series because it breaks down a lot of what is out there, how it's defined, how it functions, and when and why it best seems to work, rather than being prescriptive in any way. And in a sense, this I'd rather know what can be than what should be attitude extends to how I see processing and understanding narratives I enjoy. Any advice you hear out there is someone's opinion, and hardline classifications you run into are often ultimately made up so that we can better understand the world. Let those things refine your analysis into fuel for your own understanding and enjoyment. Let them refine your writing into a delivery system that works for you. I prefer to bumble around figuring out how I want to do that through practice because that's part of the fun for me. It doesn't have to be for you. So I'm not saying throw all your on-writing books out the window. What I'm saying is use it as a tool. Don't let it use you. To wrap up the video, I'd like to introduce a segment I thought would be funny. I'm calling the non-sponsor segment. The basic idea is that I am not being paid or sponsored by anyone. Here are my brief but true thoughts with zero affiliate links of any sort on a product I've tried before, particularly ones I've seen had real sponsorships run for. Today's non-sponsor will be Factor. In case you don't know what it is, Factor is a meal delivery service that claims to have chef-prepared meals made really easy, never frozen. You can just pop them in the microwave, no preservatives, it'll be great. I tried Factor for about a year in the depths of life science grad school hell, and I will say it was really, really helpful for me, in no small part because the work was erratic, with nothing resembling confirmed meal times, and not only do I hate cooking to begin with, but meal prepping is difficult when you don't know if you're going to have to work on the weekends or come home at 2 a.m. It's not cheaper than groceries as they claim. In fact, I found it to be quite expensive for such a small portion of food that, no matter what they say, can only be so fresh. But they are actually quite tasty and a godsend for someone who needed to be able to eat within 20 minutes at any time of the day and would rather starve to death than meal prep. I will also say I became very uncomfortable with the amount of plastic I was going through every week while I was relying on Factor. Final verdict. Great if your work is the kind of place where the only people with the luxury to eat are those blessed to genuinely have their shit together or have a partner who does. A lot of downsides if you are the average person who can afford to cook at least once a week on the regular. And I'm not joking about that luxury to eat thing. I was one of 3 people in my cohort who ate tuna and crackers for our one and only meal of the day on the regular. Okay then. Thanks for watching, I guess, and if you'd like, maybe throw my video a like. Signing off.